You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Humans have always been kinky. That's nothing new. What changes over time isn't whether people have fetishes, it's what they fetishize about and why. In this episode, we're revisiting the fascinating history behind some of the most common sexual fetishes. From leather and nylon to the enduring appeal of feet, we'll unpack how culture, technology, and history shaped these desires. We'll also dive into the unexpected history of pornography, including its surprising political roots, as well as explore how hentai emerged as a major form of erotic storytelling. My guest is Esme Louise James, who is best known for her Kinky History podcast and social media series, which has amassed nearly 3 million followers. Esme is a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, and her thesis traces an aesthetic of the erotic across 18th century literature. Esme is author of the book Kinky History, a rollicking journey through our sexual past, present, and future. Esme has been a frequent guest on this show, and if you want to hear more from her about our kinky history, you can also check out episodes 207, 208, and 343. This is going to be another amazing conversation. Stick around, and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you're looking to gain a broad understanding of human sexuality or refresh your knowledge, check out the next Human Sexuality Intensive at the Kinsey Institute. Participants will explore foundational concepts and recent developments across a range of topics related to human sexuality through an interdisciplinary, evidence-based lens. Topics will include sex, gender and sexuality, identity and intersectionality, sexual behavior and consent, dating and relationships, and more. This course is open to both emerging and established professionals looking to specialize their knowledge, as well as those seeking new career directions. Previous participants have come from all over the world, and those who successfully complete the program will receive a course certificate from the Kinsey Institute. The next intensives will be in May and June of this year. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org or check the link in the show notes. Okay, Esme, let's dive into even more kinky history. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of fetishes and pornography. So let's start by diving into fetishes. Something you talk about in your book is the fact that a lot of people are turned on by leather. And I think many of us just kind of take it for granted that leather has some sexy connotations to it. But why is that? When and where and how did leather become this fetishized object? So how did we get into leather in the first place?
Leather's a really fantastic conversation when we're looking at where do fetishes come from, whether, it's nature, nurture. Now, it should be said that leather has had a history that we see in the ancient world, especially in places like Rome. There was a tradition of sex workers in Rome who would solely be dressed in leather. So there was this kind of association with the animal hide, even back in ancient times. But where this really kind of sets off as a fetish is after the world wars. And as men are returning from war, there's this sense of what would kind of be the start of the biker gangs and everything, but the men coming back from war and bonding with one another, over collective traumas and just, having a safety net of men. Now, leather in particular was one of the, main things that a lot of the uniforms were made out of in war. And they would continue to wear this leather when, meeting on bikes throughout the US and everything. And leather then becomes this almost like symbol of this like macho manhood, but it's also linked to the queer community because a lot of these communities were safe spaces for men to explore their desire, just as many of them had during their time at war together. And so we have this transition of men coming out of war and entering queer communities that become linked with leather, to the point where I think Marlon Brando gives an interview at one stage and basically says that leather is the unofficial sign of homosexuality of the time, but also macho manhood. And there's really this turning point of seeing leather as this very kind of sexualized fetish object, which becomes part of really the origins of the kink community in particular.
Yeah, so interesting, and how, there's a connection between leather and World War II. And, leather isn't the only clothing object that people started to sexualize during that period of time. You also talk in the book about how this is around the same time that nylon came to be a very popular sexual interest. So tell us a little bit about that. How did nylon come to be associated with sex and fetishes?
It's genuinely interesting, isn't it, that the war is probably one of the most unsexy things you can think about, and yet we have all these fetishes that have, really emerged from the war times. But nylon's a fascinating one. Nylon stockings, only just before we enter World War II, come on the market by DuPont. They kind of invent the first nylon stocking that isn't a silk stocking. It's much more durable. It's going to be much more affordable, and it showcases at a New York fair and, just takes off in popularity. However, within 1 year's time, we see the start of the World War and recruitment. Now, in the previous World War, a lot of the equipment, military equipment like parachutes and bags and parts of the uniform, was made out of silk. And so when DuPont had invented this nylon stocking that was more affordable, there was this instant kind of agreement that all of the nylon would now be shipped out to make all of the parachutes and everything. And this included women essentially donating their nylon stockings to the cause. So there was collection points for women to donate all of their used and unused nylon stockings to be sent off and used for military material. But women had fallen in love with the nylon stocking, especially at the time where this was, really part of the undergarments of the time. And so there becomes this massive black market for nylon stockings. What would have cost, initially about $5 at the time would then be marked up to about $25, $30 in the underground nylon markets, to the point where in some places in America, if there was a break-in, the number one reason for theft or anything that they would look for was whether or not nylon stockings had been taken from the house. That's how they could determine if someone was breaking in for theft, because they were worth so much money. And when women didn't have nylon stockings, they started to paint their legs with the illusion of wearing nylon stockings with the seam running down the back. And there was a sense of nylon stockings becoming associated with liberty and freedom. And men that were at war would sometimes sneak out nylon stockings from their supply and would, gift it to women in Britain that they were staying with. And that's how one of the main kind of gifts you could give to someone if you were having an affair overseas while you were deployed was gifting their nylon stockings. And this all came to such a point that when the war ended, one of the slogans that was used was, "War is over, nylons are here." And the nylon stocking coming back was essentially this internalized metaphor of the war being over. There was this explosion of nylon stockings that became really fetishized within this time. It's got this association with liberty, the end of trauma. And you've also got this sense of, men and women reconnecting over the course of the war as well. It's just such a fascinating story. And it's now, in a lot of the times when we look at the most dominant fetish, it's sometimes number 4 or number 5. This is a very prevalent fetish for an item that's only been invented less than just about 100 years ago now.
Yeah, it is so, so fascinating. And I think, in the case of both leather and nylon, what you're saying is that there is a lot of historical significance and symbolism associated with these materials that cause them to kind of have this sexualized nature to them that I think has then transcended generations that have followed. And so, it's interesting, like today, people who might be into nylon or leather, their reasons for it might be very disconnected from kind of like how this originated, but that initial interest that was generated is something that has really persisted over the years.
Absolutely. Most of the time when people walk around in nylon stockings for their partner, they're not screaming "war is over."
War
But
is over.
that war is over. Or maybe they are. Who knows? But it's just so fascinating that you have what can be like the start of a fetish that is essentially, if not passed down, but there's like this sense of the sexualization remains and can continue to influence people by the way that it's shown in media and marketing, to the point, as you say, like it's still so dominant today.
Yeah, but can you imagine like if the government today was like, send us your underwear so we can make parachutes for the military? Like, somebody would be like, that military commander's got some kind of kink for used underwear or something. But
I feel like we would be a lot more critical of it today. We wouldn't be going to donate our G-strings or whatever they need this time round. Or maybe we would, who knows?
Who knows? Time will tell, I guess. We'll see. So feet are another popular fetish object, and it's one of the most common. So, for example, in my research on sexual fantasies, which I saw you kindly cited in your book, I found that about 1 in 7 adults said that they'd had a fantasy before in which feet or toes had played a prominent role. So what can you tell us about when feet started to become popular?
Feet have always been popular, and I think this is the most fascinating part of this fetish. Going all the way back to, when we have some of the first instances of writing, I'm thinking about some of the ancient Greek works and everything. We see this fantasization and pedestalization of the foot. In stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the feet of people are always described. The woman's lovely feet, her pretty feet. There's a lot of time spent describing women's feet. In, the origin story of Aphrodite by Herod, one of the things, her beautiful feet walk on the ground and life spurts underneath her gorgeous feet and through her toes. And there's a lot of time spent on the foot. And we see this in ancient Rome as well. We see this in ancient China. There's this constant idea of like fantasization about the foot. And we've had a few theories about where this foot fetish comes from and why it is so dominant. One of them comes from Dr. Ramashandra, who was studying phantom limb syndrome. And while he was studying phantom limb syndrome, he found in those patients that not only would they be able to feel where their missing limb was, this kind of sensation that it was still there, but when that sensation was stimulated, they also felt sexual stimulation, which was a kind of accidental discovery of his research. And so he proposed in his paper that potentially in some people, there is a cross-wiring of the area of the brain that's responsible for stimulation in the feet and the area of the brain that is responsible for stimulation in the genitals, because these are very close together. Then, that's the kind of like physiological theory. And then on the other side of things, there's been studies done about the fact that foot fetishes become most common during sexually transmitted epidemics in history. And I found this one fascinating coming from that, history side of things. But they've seen in the 13th century gonorrhea epidemic, the 16th, 19th century syphilis epidemic, and, more recently in the 1980s during the AIDS epidemic, that whenever we have these sexually transmitted epidemics that make, interaction with someone else's genitals far more risky and, they're really trying to get people not to do it, the next area of the body to be sexualized is the foot. The troubadour poets start singing praise to like the beautiful foot of the woman and write endless poetry about her slender feet, the arches of feet. The feet become the focus. In the 16th century, we kind of get this fashion of toe cleavage that comes out where the shoe will kind of sit just so you can see the start of every single toe. And that becomes this like, giant fad. And a lot of the paintings and portraits you will see of the time really kind of have the, the woman with that one little toe sticking out so you can kind of see the toes. And in the 19th century, that's where we start to see, or at least in recorded history, fetishes and stimulation kind of being offered at brothels across Europe and America. And it's really fascinating because there is this constant, occurrence that when the genitals are off limits, we go to feet. So is there a biological factor in play? We don't really know.
I think with most sexual interests, there's probably a biopsychosocial explanation. So, it could be that there is something about the brain and how it's wired and, crossover between genital and foot stimulation, and that could be part of it. But then there's also the social and psychological side of things as well, in terms of how feet are depicted or portrayed that can start to create more interest in that. So it's probably some interaction between those things. And I think too, with something like the foot, historically, women were not wearing shorts or skirts or mini skirts or anything like that. Like you didn't see any part of a woman's lower body exposed. And then, so if you can think about, the feet were sort of the first thing that started to be exposed with the foot cleavage and so forth. And then like progressively over time, like dresses started to get shorter and you might see the ankle, right? And at one point in time, like the ankle, like seeing that was considered to be really sexy, or the calf, lots of women actually didn't used to shave below their knees, like when, in cultures where leg shaving was common. But yeah, it's something where sort of gradually you've seen more of women's legs and feet over time. But I think, with the feet being kind of like the first thing that you saw, that might have started to lay the groundwork for some of these foot fetishes. Hey guys, have you ever wanted more from your orgasms? Then you're going to want to check out Load Boost from VB Health. VB Health has a simple mission: creating supplements that work. Load Boost is designed to improve the taste, volume, and overall health of your semen. This doctor-formulated supplement can help to enhance your orgasms and pleasure and support your fertility at the same time. VB Health takes quality seriously. Made in the USA and NSF certified, their products are produced in an FDA-registered facility. They even share their third-party lab results publicly because they value trust and transparency. This isn't anything like the junk they're selling in a gas station. Thousands of guys from all across the US and 45 different countries have already tried Load Boost, and over 88% of the reviews are 4 or 5 stars from verified buyers. Elevate your performance with Load Boost. You just might become someone's new favorite performer. Learn more and get yours at loadboost.com. Visit loadboost.com and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes.
Absolutely. And one thing that I did find really fascinating as well, when we're kind of like, I suppose, looking at that biosocial factor, and we're taking into consideration that the most recent time, at least from this study that we saw, this giant uptake was during the 1980s, during the AIDS epidemic. And if we do a breakdown, and I think this came from your study into sexual fantasies, the breakdown of the numbers of people who were interested in all of these desires, men were, the people who are most interested in feet. And then after that was gay men in particular have this really intense interest in feet. And I thought that was really fascinating because, as you're saying, it's the men that were looking at the women's legs and everything, and that these skirts getting shorter and everything. And then you have during the AIDS epidemic where there's this real push in a lot of pornographic magazines all of a sudden towards feet and legs and everything. And when the gay community is most affected by the AIDS epidemic, I think it's really interesting that when, you did your study, they were such a dominant factor. And I wonder if, that would have been the case if it was the other way around. I found it genuinely fascinating. Women, we're sitting pretty low down on the list of people interested in feet. We need a bit more foot entertainment. Really get us going.
Yeah, it is so interesting. And yeah, that is something that I've seen in my research and other work, is that, interest in feet predominantly is among men, but seems to be especially higher among gay and bisexual men in particular. And I think that's an area that is definitely worth exploring more. So let's talk about the history of porn. Now, before we really dive into that, I want to ask an important question. So we know that erotic depictions and erotic art have a very long history, but how do we know if they were actually pornographic or not, right? Not everything that depicts sex or nudity is porn. Porn is very much in the eye of the beholder, and it's quite subjective. So as a historian, when you're looking at old erotic depictions, how do you determine or say what is porn versus what isn't?
It's a really interesting debate, and I think separating the idea of, erotic art and work from pornographic art and work is really, really important to do. It's the same thing when we look at the history of sex toys, for instance, and, we can say, well, that's just a stone phallus. Maybe it was used to decorate the caves. And then we look at, okay, well, no writing of the time describes people using it. So they probably were using it. And so when we kind of see all these erotic depictions, a lot of them, especially in places like ancient Rome, for instance, and when we go around the sites of Pompeii, there's a sense that exposure to sexuality and erotic art was a lot more common than we see today. So it wasn't always sexual. They have penises, literally hanging from roofs and above some of their doors and everything to ward off evil spirits. But at the same time, in some of the Romanian brothels, we see erotic artwork that is around all of the rooms and everything. And that is very clearly there to stimulate sexual ideas and excitement. So we know ideas of erotic art being used as we would see as pornography, essentially, to really get people going. So it has been around for many, many years. Pornography as a genre is only defined in the 18th, 19th century. That is actually where we define media that is made and solely intended to stimulate sexual desire. That's not to say that it hasn't existed before, but it's just to kind of clarify that that's when we actually define pornography. And we start writing novels, for instance, and pornographic pamphlets, which are solely, I think they're described as books to read with one hand. They're solely to experience sexual pleasure, and there's no really other use or need for them. So I think that's kind of like the definition there, when we don't always know that the role that, erotic art played, but we do know it's made to stimulate the imagination and stimulate senses of sexual pleasure. That's always been there. But in many ways, we've been able to kind of have that as part of our everyday life in a way that today we would see as quite pornographic, but it really wasn't. Sometimes it had spiritual purposes, sometimes it had political purposes, So that would be the definition to kind of hold in mind.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all of that. And, it is very easy or tempting to look back at some of these historical depictions of sex or eroticism and just assume that it was pornographic, but you're overlaying a modern day subjective interpretation over that, right? So we need to try and understand, what was the context? How are these things used? And, that's where I think the work sometimes of historians can get a little bit tricky, is because sometimes there isn't always clear records of, what was the purpose behind this, or how was this used? But it is an important, sort of starting point for kind of understanding the history of porn. And I want to go to something that you mentioned there, and something that you also talk about in the book, which is how you say that porn was often used as a political tool, which I think is super fascinating. So tell us how porn has been used for political purposes historically, and is that still true today?
I absolutely love this topic of conversation. When I say that, pornography gets defined in the 18th, 19th century, it does so at such an influential time. One of the reasons that pornography had to be defined was because as the printing press boomed, pamphlets that were erotic in nature just, really, really took off in across America, across Europe in particular. And one of the main ways that these pamphlets were used, which were very pornographic in nature, was that they were a guise for political and information sharing. So you would have a pamphlet that's being reports of the royal palace. Here's what's going on today. Marie Antoinette has fucked 50 men and 60 women, and she's having an orgy. That would be the nature of these pamphlets that would be printed every single morning. They were incredibly pornographic in nature, but they had a political motive. What historians or recorders of the time said, and what we can kind of see now, is that the French Revolution was so heavily motivated by pornography. It was because of all of these pamphlets and novels, and there was even operas about Marie Antoinette that were pornographic, that really kind of depicted the aristocracy as being this incredibly deranged, deluded, and, libertines, essentially, that were stealing everyone's money and then using all that money to buy endless amounts of dildos and doing nothing to help the country, but just holding constant orgies every night. That's what these pamphlets were saying. And when you're coming from a place, especially where media literacy has not yet been taught, it's not on our radar, we've only just invented the printing press, what is in the substance of these pamphlets, especially after repeated repetition, becomes true in people's minds. So much so that when Versailles is invaded and attacked, some of the atrocities that were committed were actually reenactments of the most popular pornographic pamphlets and publications of the time, because, people genuinely believed that the royals were engaging in this kind of behavior. And I think when we're looking at the conversation of the role that pornography plays today, I think it's really important to remember that this was the origins of pornography as a genre. It was something that was made to be a social and political influence while stimulating, because there is this sense of when you're in a heightened state of sexual stimulation, you do become more susceptible to ideas and everything. Everything feels a lot more appealing than it would outside of a state of arousal. So you're far more susceptible to ideas. And when we look at how pornography, can still be used today, things like revenge porn was still AI pornography, I think is, a huge argument. And the same thing being used, someone's likeness is being taken and put in a fabricated scenario that is pornographic in nature, often to destroy someone's reputation. That is no different to what was happening to the likes of Marie Antoinette and the aristocracy of that time.
So fascinating. Yeah, this idea of pornography as propaganda, I'm sure it's something that most people probably haven't stopped to think about or consider. But, as you explained, that's sort of the origins, the root of where this happened. And it's still going on today, just in very different forms. Now, I have one more question for you about porn, and it's about a genre of porn you write about in the book. And it's one that I often get asked a lot of questions about, which is, why are people into hentai porn? So
I knew this question was coming.
So how did animated porn or cartoon porn come to be so popular? What are the origins or roots of that?
On the last few years of when you're looking at the top hits on Pornhub, I think it's, important to mention that hentai has managed to take some of the top spots for really the last 5 years now. It's a really dominant category of porn, and interest in tentacles in particular. And this is, far from a new thing, as seems to be the catchphrase of kinky history. And one of the first times that we kind of see tentacle pornography is in 19th century Japan. And it was at this time that Japan, was facing a lot of censorship laws and new laws for artists about what they could and could not depict in their art. And one of the things was no more genitals in art that's too sexually explicit. And one of the main ways that artists like Hokusai started to get around these laws was by using squids to cover up the genitals. Why squids? Because it comes from this Japanese fable of the underwater princess who dives into the sea to kind of retrieve a jewel for her lover. And as she's retrieving the jewel from the dragon, underwater dragon king, he sends like an army of aquatic creatures after her who, essentially murder her before after she gives the jewel back and she falls to her death. Now, artists like Hokusai were reimagining the fable of this princess, and they decided to kind of reimagine it as a more sexually pleasurable experience that she has with the aquatic creatures. And when you look at it's the dream of the fisherman's wife, Hokusai is using tentacles to kind of cover up all aspects of her body, while also, seeing these squid-like creatures performing cunnilingus, kissing, stimulating her body. And this really caught on, and it's kind of remained quite popular because a lot of manga artists even today discuss the use of squids as allowing them to get around things that they otherwise couldn't depict in censorship laws. And so there's this also, when we're talking about how fetishes come about, there is this idea of like repeated exposure to sexualized squids and tentacles, which has 200, 100 years later, now become one of our most dominant pornographic categories. It's even depicted on the likes of Netflix's Sex Education. There was, in the first season, a whole exploration of tentacle pornography. I think there's a production of Romeo and Juliet with tentacles. It's become so dominant. And, it came from this need of artists to kind of get around censorship laws. And nowadays, we're just into Krakens.
That we are. So, yeah, I think the lesson from that and from a lot of the other stories you've shared is that Sexual desire always finds a way. If there are restrictions or limitations that are placed on our sexuality, for example, via censorship laws or via sexually transmitted infection epidemics or other types of social or institutional restrictions on sexuality, sexual desire finds a different way to express itself to gratify its needs. And I think this can help to explain in a lot of ways why we are kinky people, and we've always been kinky, right? It's because our sexual desire is just so flexible and adaptable to kind of meet like the circumstances of where we are at a given point in time.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the need for constant conversations about sex that are educational and empowering, that, as you say, sex will always find a way. So we may as well have dialogues that are open to ensure that we're doing it safely and ethically at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Esme. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Absolutely. So my book, Kinky History, is now available worldwide, and you can find me across socials at esme.louise, wherever you get your social media content.
Well, I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.